So guys, a couple of more slides in chapter 3. Remember, chapter 3 is about gains from trade. We'll learn in this chapter about comparative advantage. Remember, comparative advantage is associated with the lower opportunity cost, specialization, and also if you have a comparative advantage in production of that good, you have to export that good. We'll look at the case study of two countries, Japan and Korea, and we calculate opportunity cost for both countries, figure out their comparative advantage, and when two countries started trade, we said that countries became better off because they started consume outside of production possibilities frontier. Once again, why? Because they started to specialize and they started to kind of trade based on comparative advantage. So remember that point A was still only consumption point but not production point. So the last thing that we need to do here, we need to talk about absolute advantage. And absolute advantage is producer's ability to produce a good using fewer inputs, or we usually say that producer has an absolute advantage in production of a good if that producer is more productive. So once again, absolute advantage. This is country's ability to produce a good using fewer inputs or resources. And usually in our examples, those inputs are labor hours. Or we usually said that producer has an absolute advantage in a good if producer is more productive. Guys, remember the difference. Comparative advantage, we calculate the opportunity cost and we analyze who has a lower opportunity cost, then that producer is going to have a comparative advantage. If we're talking about absolute advantage, we don't need to calculate anything. What we're going to do, we're going to analyze our table. So remember, absolute advantage, this is country's ability to produce using fewer resources. Let's start with that. So in our particular scenario, our resources were not given to us, but let's assume that both of the countries, they had, for example, random number, 10,000 labor hours available to produce this steel and these TVs. And for Korea, the same. Korea had 10,000 labor hours to produce these 8 units of steel or 2 units of television. So, which producer is going to use fewer resources? What we need to do, we need to compare units of steel in Japan to units of steel in Korea. Just think about it. Japan working 10,000 labor hours and producing 6 units of steel. Korea working 10,000 labor hours and producing 8 units of steel. My question is, who is using fewer resources? And please don't rush to answer, but think about it. I'm going to break it down like that. Japan producing steel, produced only 6 units of steel and spent 10,000 labor hours. Now, think about Korea. I'm going to take Korea's production of units of steel and I'm going to say Korea is producing 6 units of steel plus 2 units of steel and it's going to be equal to 8. Just think about it. When Korea is going to produce these 6 units of steel, okay, Japan produced 6 units of steel and spent 10,000 labor hours. When Korea produced 6 units of steel, is Korea going to use all available resources, all 10,000 labor hours? And the answer is no, because Korea is going to use less labor hours on production of 6 units of steel, because Korea in 10,000 labor hours producing 8 units of steel altogether. So therefore, let's suppose, random number, Korea is going to spend 8,000 labor hours on producing 6 units of steel. Therefore, we have left 2,000 labor hours on producing these last 2 units of steel. My question is, who is using fewer resources? Korea is using fewer resources. Because once again, if we're going to compare the same amount of units, 6 units of steel for Korea and 6 units of steel for Japan. Korea using less labor hours in production of these 6 units of steel. So therefore, Korea is going to have absolute advantage in production units of steel. So let's talk about TVs over here. So Japan working, remember, 10,000 labor hours and producing 3 TVs. Korea working 10,000 labor hours and producing 2 TVs. Who has an absolute advantage in production of units of TVs? Again, remember, absolute advantage, we're looking right now who is using fewer inputs or fewer resources, fewer inputs. And these inputs, this is our labor hours. Just think about it. Again, I'm going to start with Korea. Korea spent all 10,000 labor hours and produced 2 TVs. Japan, I'm going to take these 3 TVs that Japan produced and I'm going to say it's producing 2 plus 1, 3 altogether. Is Japan going to spend all 10,000 hours on these 2 TVs? And the answer is no. Japan altogether working 10,000 labor hours and producing 3 TVs. So therefore, once again, random number. Let's suppose Japan is going to spend 7,000 labor hours on producing 2 TVs, and therefore the rest, 3,000, of course this rate is not correct, it's just random numbers, 3,000 labor hours on producing this one last TV. So who is using fewer resources to produce 2 units of TV? Japan does. Therefore, Japan is going to have absolute advantage in production of TVs. Another point of view or another approach, remember, we can look at the productivity. Who is more productive? So just think about again. I'm going to start with steel. Japan and Korea, they work in 10,000 labor hours and they're producing units of steel. In these 10,000 labor hours, Japan produced only 6 TVs. But Korea spent 10,000 labor hours on producing units of steel and produced 8 TVs. Who is more productive? Korea is, because in the same amount of hours, Korea producing more units. So therefore, Korea has absolute advantage in production of units of steel. And let's analyze televisions once again from productivity point of view. Japan working 10,000 labor hours, and in these 10,000 labor hours, they're producing 3 TVs. Korea working the same amount of hours, 10,000 labor hours, and produce only 2 TVs. Who is more productive? Japan is. So therefore, Japan has absolute advantage in production of units of TVs. So guys, this is what we need to remember. I should have left more space over here. You need to know this. Country can have absolute advantage in production of both goods, but comparative advantage in production of only one good. So therefore, in this particular example, I think actually it happened to be Japan. Well, it's not the same as our comparative advantage, but cost. But it can be a situation when one producer can have absolute advantage in production of both goods. So this one didn't happen like that, but there are scenarios like that. But remember, comparative advantage, when you calculate the cost, when you calculate the cost. Comparative advantage, you can have comparative advantage in production of only one good. And one more thing in this chapter, guys, you need to know what are imports and what are exports. I kind of hope that you know by now what it is. So remember, when we're talking about imports, these are goods that produced, okay, this is produced abroad and sold domestically. Okay, they produce somewhere outside of the country. So they produce outside of the country and they sold domestically. It means they brought here in our country and brought and sold in our country. And export, remember, this is something that we produce in our country. So we produce inside the country and we sell it abroad. We sell it somewhere outside of the country. Those are going to be exports. So that's it for chapter 3, guys. I know it's a lot of information. Opportunity cost, it's not that easy of a concept. Please look at the videos, read the book. I know you can crush it. I hope you know more about international trade or how trade makes everybody better off.